This is Story Recapped. Today I'm going to explain a comedy and romance film called 8 Days a Week. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. On the last summer before college, a nerdy teenager, Peter, stands in front of the house of his crush, Erica, looking at her bedroom window. He contemplates all the embarrassing things he's done in his life and is about to do one more. Earlier, Peter is watching Erica play by the sprinkler with neighborhood kids when his grandfather, Nano, joins him and comments on his admiration towards her. Peter doesn't admit to it initially, but when Nano asks if she knows of his feelings for her, Peter reasons that she's got a boyfriend and is leaving for college in 3 months. Nano encourages him and tells a story about their ancestor, Giuseppe Luigi Bandini, who, like Peter, had admired a beautiful girl who just ignored him. To prove his love, Giuseppe declared to stand outside the girl's balcony day and night until the girl fell in love. The girl didn't mind at first, but Giuseppe was relentless until finally, the girl reciprocated his feelings and let him into her house. They made love so passionately that the ground shook, and people claimed it caused the 1874 earthquake. Peter thinks the act is ridiculous, but in his imagination, Giuseppe encourages him to work up the nerve. So Peter walks to Erica's lawn and tells her he will stay there to provide his devotion. Erica thinks it's sweet but then rejects him, telling him they're just friends. At this, Peter fantasizes about a noir film, where Erica shoots him with a pistol after sending him into the friend zone. Giuseppe appears in this fantasy and helps him up, urging him to not give up. Then, Erica's macho boyfriend Nick arrives, and Peter is annoyed with his mannerisms, including the constant crotch grabbing and hawking before spitting. On the front porch, Erica gets into an argument with her father, who won't allow her to go out in a short skirt. Erica does what he asks and goes back inside but then escapes out a window. She runs to Nick and immediately jumps on him to make out. They only stop when they notice Peter watching, and Erica tells Nick what Peter is up to. Then, they just laugh and leave in Nick's car. Erica's parents come out and tell Peter they're glad he's there to take Erica away. Her parents are extremely religious, and Erica's mother offers him crucifix cookies. Peter takes one, figuring out how to make her parents hate him for Erica to fall in love with him. Across the street, Peter's father learns of his plan and gets upset. He tries to take him back and talk some sense into him, but Peter refuses to listen. Then, when his dad resorts to grabbing his legs, Nono distracts Peter's dad by wetting himself. Later, Peter's best friend Matt sits with them on the lawn. Unlike Peter, who's convinced he's been in love with Erica since they were kids, Matt tells him it will not work because they're losers. Matt has already given up on life, refusing to go to college, and is content to be self-sufficient. Since Peter will be staying on the lawn all summer, Matt asks to use Peter's address for a package he's hiding from his parents. Peter agrees, but only after making Matt admit that he sometimes wishes to have a girlfriend. However, Matt refuses, saying a huge watermelon will be his girlfriend that night. Peter spends the day watching The Neighbors. There's the paranoid Mr. Mays, who always drives around the block several times, convinced he's being followed. There's also a young bully who likes playing with explosives. There's an old couple across the street who goes out for morning walks daily. They seem so sad to Peter as he watches the husband wheel his wife, who's terminally ill. Peter also spies on Mrs. Lewis as she works out in her home, and also sees a strange old woman eating her dinner in her car. As Peter watches the bully pick on a younger kid, he wonders if Matt was right about them being losers. That night, Peter gets bored and uses the time to read a book about lovemaking, vowing to be Erica's greatest boyfriend when she comes around. Since the book's illustrations feature an ugly man with a beautiful woman, Peter is emboldened and fantasizes about himself and Erica. When Erica and Nick finally arrive, Peter taunts Nick about his spitting, and later, his sexuality. The miffed Nick pushes Peter to the ground and challenges him to a fight. He also tricks Peter into landing the first punch, but when Peter charges, Nick hits him in the groin and leaves him squirming in pain. The following morning, Erica looks out to see if Peter's still there, and Peter takes this as a good sign. So while Erica takes a shower, he attempts to freshen himself up. Peter runs home, but his dad has changed the locks and kicks him out until he gives up his nonsense. Desperate, Peter goes to Matt's house, and by the time Erica peeks out the window again, Peter is back in his spot like nothing happened. Later, Matt brings Peter some sliced watermelons, and they talk about Matt's theory that being either a bully or a loser is genetic. Peter offers his own theory about being able to tell a woman's personality by the shape of her bosoms. He explains this by comparing several of their neighbors' busts with their personalities, like the crazy lady with the weird chest, or Mrs. Lewis, whose bosoms he compares with melons stored too long in the store. They then spy on a sunbathing Erica, and Peter goes on an elaborate explanation, romanticizing her personality with the mere appearance of her chest. That evening, Nano sneaks out some dinner to Peter, who hasn't eaten anything except some of Matt's watermelons. Peter expresses his doubts about Nano's earlier advice, so Nano tells him another story of a pilot who's had a bad case of hemorrhoids and ends up marrying the nurse who tended to him every day after the surgery. Peter doesn't find it lovely until Nano reveals that it's the story of his parents. Peter stays on Erica's front lawn for days, relentlessly waiting on the grass or the front porch. He entertains himself by dancing on his own, playing with the hose, and reading the Kinsey report to pass the time. Peter also keeps watching The Neighborhood, calling it the TV of life. During this time, he's seen Erica walk out in different outfits, never wearing the same thing twice. Parents in the neighborhood also start paying Peter to babysit their kids, knowing he won't leave the property. One of them is Robert, a young boy Peter teaches to fight for himself against bullies. Soon, the days turn into weeks, and Peter notices changes in the neighborhood, like how the old man doesn't take his sick wife out on walks anymore. He also witnesses how weird Erica's parents are, reinforcing his vow to do something to make them hate him. Some nights he would see Mrs. Lewis changing clothes after her workouts, and some nights he'd hear his parents from their bedroom. Matt keeps asking about his package, but it hasn't come yet. Peter also notices the strangeness of the old man, seeing him arguing with a lady friend on the sidewalk. One day, Erica looks out and is endeared to see Peter reading a book to Robert. Peter doesn't see her though, as she quickly goes back inside when he looks up. More than half of the summer has passed, and Peter hasn't gotten anywhere. Finally, in August, Erica speaks to him, asking him to help her sneak out. Peter is annoyed that he's helping her get with Nick, but he agrees. And when Erica steps on his shoulders to get down, Peter gets a view up her skirt. This makes Peter lose footing, and they fall, with Peter's face ending up between Erica's thighs. This is how they begin talking, and every day, Peter would do something to intentionally make Erica fall on him. When Erica returns at night, they also talk about random things, sometimes playing a game of Would You Rather, which makes the girl laugh. One evening, Mrs. Lewis catches Peter looking, so she teases him and lets him see her body. Matt then arrives and hangs out with Peter, and they both see the old man acting suspiciously in his house. They assume that he's done something to his wife, and that the lady friend they saw him talking to the other day could be his mistress. They also hear him sawing in his yard, leading Peter to believe the worst. The next morning, Peter closely watches the old man drive off. Meanwhile, young Robert decides to stand up for himself, but the bully is stronger, sending Robert careening into the road and getting hit by a car. Robert gets 40 stitches and 2 casts, making Peter wonder if he shouldn't have meddled. That evening, Erica and Nick come home from a trip to the lake, and Peter is intimidated by what Nick is packing in his Speedos. He also overhears them talking about getting intimate, so Peter loudly sings "Oh Come All Ye Faithful" to distract them. It works at the moment, getting Erica out of the mood, so Nick rushes downstairs to beat up Peter, and Peter fantasizes about finishing Nick with martial arts. But when Peter is pushed to the ground, he notices the tissue paper sticking out of Nick's Speedo and calls him out, embarrassing Nick and making him run back inside. Peter laughs at first, but Nick and Erica soon resume their intimacy, and he lies back on the ground, defeated. When he wakes up the next day, Peter sees his parents selling off his stuff in a yard sale. Nano tries to stop his dad from selling Peter's collection of dirty magazines, and he gets so upset that he suffers a heart attack. Initially, Peter thinks he's faking it to help him again, as Nano wakes momentarily, winking and smiling, only to stop breathing in the end. Peter skips standing under Erica's window for a few days until Nano's funeral. Erica waits for him on the front porch, and when Peter comes back, she meets him with a hug. Peter immediately gets excited down there, but Erica brushes it off and hugs him more. Peter returns to Erica's lawn, and one day, when neighborhood kids are playing slip and slide, Matt comes and tells him again how silly his Romeo act is. Peter's resolve begins to falter, as Nano was the only one who thought it was a good idea. But as he thinks about calling it quits, they witness witness a bandaged Robert getting back at the bully, inspiring Peter once again. One night, Mrs. Lewis comes on to him and starts kissing and getting on top of him. As Mrs. Lewis has her way, Peter fantasizes about Erica's possible reactions to catching them in a compromising position. Erica could either be mad about it or she could enjoy watching it. Peter considers giving it his all, thinking being seen in a stellar performance would make Erica want him more, but he changes his mind, choosing to not waste all his work that summer. As Mrs. Lewis goes down on him, Peter thinks about mundane things to keep calm. Then, when he deflates, Mrs. Lewis gets disappointed and leaves him be. The following morning, Matt arrives wearing a neck brace. He claims to have been successful in orally pleasuring himself, following the Kinsey report, but hurt his neck in the process. Matt asks about his package again, but soon notices that Peter isn't acting like his usual self. Peter worries that he's running out of time as Erica will be leaving in a few weeks. Matt gloats, but Peter is still determined to win Erica's heart. One day, as Erica's father and his weird church friends are recreating Da Vinci's The Last Supper, Erica gleefully comes out of the house, excited for a trip to Lollapalooza with Nick. Erica's father gets mad as he's banned her from going out, so Peter comes to her rescue, threatening to break a baby Jesus statue he's made unless he lets Erica go. Erica's father relents, but Peter doesn't give it back right away, and he is chased around until Erica's father tackles him. The baby Jesus flies away and shatters on the sidewalk. That night, Erica returns from her trip and sits beside Peter on the curb. She thanks him for what he's done, and kisses him on the cheek before heading inside. The next day, Peter talks to Matt about his progress, adding that he's having great conversations with Erica. Matt is skeptical, reminding him that he's in the friend zone. Their conversation then shifts to the old man from across the street, as Peter regularly sees him coming and going with lots of black bags. Then, Matt's package arrives, and it's an electronic adult toy that Matt is ecstatic to try out. Eventually, Erica starts to open up to Peter. Their meaningful conversations usually begin with mundane topics that naturally dig deeper, like the day Erica started distrusting her parents. This gets Peter into thinking he'll never get Erica to trust him too. When Erica calls it a night, Peter sees the old man loading black bags in his car again, but he gets distracted by the sounds of Matt using his new toy and getting injured with it. Later, the strange woman appears on the street, playing with sparklers. She convinces Peter to do the same, and he does so reluctantly but eventually enjoys it. With new understanding, Peter asks the woman why she does strange things, making others in the neighborhood avoid her. The woman doesn't care about them and explains all the weird things she's been doing, telling him it's all about perspective. The next day, as Peter flattens Nick's tires, Matt tells him that his toy shorted on his manhood, and he's now unable to perform. He then attempts to convince Peter to go with him and find an experienced lady to help him get it up again, but Peter declines. Peter decides to stick it out until the end of the summer. Even if Erica doesn't fall in love with him, Matt accuses him of being inconsiderate of his situation, and it ends in a fight. That afternoon, Peter's dad gets kicked out of the house for bringing his mom the wrong anniversary gift, and later that evening, his dad copies Peter's strategy of staying on the lawn. It doesn't work, so the following night, Peter shares his lovemaking book, giving his dad an idea. Filled with newfound knowledge, he rushes back to the house and breaks the kitchen door to get to his wife, and they make love right there on the floor. Outside, Peter sees the old man unloading black bags from his car. In the morning, Erica peeks and finds Peter sleeping on the sidewalk. When Peter wakes up, his dad brings him breakfast and apologizes. He also welcomes Peter back into their house when he's ready. That night, Nick arrives as Peter tells Erica about the old man from across the street. Nick doesn't believe his stories, but Peter insists, so the three of them sneak out to investigate. They are then caught snooping by the old man, and he threatens to let them see what he's done. Nick panics and leaves, getting hit by Mr. Mays as he's running away. Peter and Erica beg the old man to let them go, but the old man pushes them inside the house, and they fall into a large swimming pool. It turns out that the man has been building a tropical paradise inside as a gift to his ailing wife. The wife is unharmed and asks about the teenagers, so the man explains to Peter and Erica that they wanted to go to Tahiti for their second honeymoon, but his wife got sick. He wanted to recreate the experience for her, but wasn't granted the permit in time to build the pool, so he secretly did it inside the house instead. Upon learning that, the two teens promised to keep it a secret. The next day is the last day of summer, and Peter still waits in front of Erica's house. Matt comes, telling him he's changed his mind, and he's also going to college tomorrow. Matt wants to spend the last day with Peter, so he invites him to a party. Initially, Peter declines, worried he'll miss his last chance with Erica, but he reconsiders and spends the day with his best friend. Later, Erica looks out the window and calls out to Peter, but he's already gone. on. That night, as Peter and Matt walk back from the party, they pass by Mrs. Lewis' house, and she invites them inside for a cup of cocoa. Peter declines but introduces Matt to her, and Matt accepts her invitation. As Peter walks away, he hears Matt cheering as he regains his ability to perform intimately. Peter walks back to Erica's home, thinking he's lost his chance. But when he turns, Erica is standing under his window. Peter calls her, and when he walks closer, Erica admits she missed him. They then kiss passionately, and Peter takes her inside to finally make love. In the afterglow, Peter remembers his grandfather's words about how lovemaking is a person's main purpose in life.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.